The sea does not keep secrets. It swallows them. In the black heart of the Atlantic, in the year of our Lord 1493, a tempest of impossible fury tore the ocean apart. Waves rose like liquid mountains, their gray peaks crowned with frothing rage. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid sheets, driven by a wind that screamed with the voice of a dying god. At the mercy of this chaos was a single, tiny ship, a Portuguese-style caravel named the Nina. Her timbers groaned, a sound of wood in its final agony. Her sails, long since furled, were shredded to ghostly ribbons that whipped and cracked in the gale. On her bucking deck, a man stood lashed to the mast, his face a mask of salt, spray, and grim resolve. He was not a king, not a priest, but in that moment he held the fate of a world in his hands. This was Cristoforo Colombo, known to history as Christopher Columbus. He was the admiral of the ocean sea, and his ocean was trying to kill him. He feared not just for his life, but for his legacy. The discovery, the glory, the proof, it was all held within the fragile shell of this battered ship. If the Nina went down, the story would sink with her. The world he had found would become a rumor again, a phantom island on a madman's chart. Driven by a terror greater than death, he had stumbled below deck. There, amidst the stench of bilge water and fear, he had taken a piece of parchment. With trembling hands, he wrote. He wrote of the islands he had claimed for Spain, of the gentle people he had met, of the promise of gold, and of the route to this earthly paradise. He sealed the document in a wax cloth, placed it inside a small wooden cask, and hammered the lid shut. He carried it back to the deck, a tiny ark containing the genesis of a new age. He held it for a moment, a prayer on his lips, then cast it into the churning abyss. The barrel vanished instantly, a speck of hope devoured by the maelstrom. It was a message to a future he might never see, a final, desperate act to ensure that his name would not be forgotten. For he knew what he carried was more than a story of discovery. It was the beginning of a collision, and its secret had to survive. Before we sail any further into that storm and its consequences, make sure you are subscribed and have sounded the notification bell. You are helping us uncover the lost voyages and hidden histories that shaped our world. To understand his desperation in that moment, we must rewind back to the warm, sun-drenched shores of the island he had named Hispaniola. It was January 1493. The air was thick with the scent of unknown blossoms and wood smoke. The great flagship, the Santa Maria, was gone, its bones shattered on a coral reef on Christmas Eve. From her salvaged timbers, Columbus had ordered the construction of a crude fort, naming it La Navidad. It was the first European settlement in the New World, a scar of progress on a pristine landscape. He was leaving 39 men behind, a skeleton crew armed with crossbows, a single cannon, and a mountain of promises. They were to find the source of the island's gold, to maintain good relations with the local Taino people, and to await his return. As Columbus prepared to depart, he watched them on the shore, a mix of bravado and unspoken fear in their eyes. They were volunteers, gamblers betting their lives on a future they could not imagine. They waved until their forms blurred into the green of the jungle. None of them would be seen alive again. The two remaining ships, the tiny Nina and the faster Pinta, were loaded with evidence. Not the mountains of gold and spices he had promised the Spanish crown, but a curious collection of artifacts. There were brilliantly colored parrots that shrieked in their wooden cages, strange plants with medicinal properties, and a small, disappointing cache of gold masks and trinkets. But the most important cargo was human. On the decks of the ships stood several Taino men, taken from their homes. Columbus saw them as living proof of his success, specimens to be presented at the royal court. They were symbols of the Indies. To the crew, they were curiosities. To the admiral, they were the key to a second, much larger expedition. The Taino themselves stood in silent dignity, their world shrinking with every league the ships sailed east. They watched their island, their entire universe, recede into a blue haze. They were caught between worlds, their eyes holding a profound and bottomless sorrow. They saw the bearded men who prayed to a wooden cross, but whose eyes burned with a hunger for yellow metal. They felt the alien motion of the ship, a prison of wood and rope, carrying them toward a fate they could not comprehend. The departure was already steeped in mistrust. The captain of the Pinta, Martín Alonso Pinzón, was a brilliant but proud mariner. Months earlier, he had separated from the fleet, chasing rumors of a golden island. He had returned only recently, his ship's hold heavier with gold than Columbus's. The reunion was cold. Columbus, ever suspicious, recorded in his journal that Pinzón was driven by greed and ambition. He believed Pinzón had intended to sail back to Spain alone and claim the glory of the discovery for himself. For now, a fragile truce held. They were two ships against the vast, unknown Atlantic. They needed each other. On January 16th, the order was given. Anchors were weighed. The last ties to the New World were severed. The prows of the Nina and the Pinta turned eastward toward home. The men were jubilant. They had survived. They had seen wonders. They were going to be heroes. The first weeks of the return voyage were deceptively kind. The trade winds, which had been a constant struggle on the journey out, were now at their backs. The ships sliced through calm, turquoise waters under a brilliant cloudless sky. A spirit of optimism filled the crews. They sang sea shanties, mended sails, and dreamed of the welcome they would receive in Palos. Life settled into a rhythm. The clang of the ship's bell marking the watches. The creak of the rudder. The murmur of prayers at sunset. The ocean was a vast, empty wilderness of water and light. Days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's arc across the sky. For the Taino captives, this emptiness was a new kind of prison. The endless water was a barrier more absolute than any iron chain. They grew sick from the sailors' food, their bodies unaccustomed to salted meat and hardtack. They huddled together for warmth against the chilling ocean breeze, their thin cotton garments no match for the open sea. One of them, then another, would die on this journey, their bodies unceremoniously committed to the deep, their stories sinking into the silence. They would sometimes point west, a silent, desperate gesture. They were trying to show the sailors the way back to their home, the only map they knew etched in their memory. The Spanish sailors would just smile or clap them on the back, seeing the gesture as a quaint, savage tick. The communication was a pantomime of misunderstanding, a prelude to the centuries of misinterpretation that would follow. Columbus, meanwhile, was a man possessed. He spent hours in his small cabin, hunched over his charts and logbooks. He was engaged in a complex deception. He kept two logs. One, the true log, recorded the actual distances they traveled each day. The other, a false log, deliberately underestimated the mileage. He showed the false log to the crew, to quell their fears about how far they truly were from the known world. He was a master of illusion, navigating not just by stars, but by the psychology of his men. But his charts were a work of fiction, a blend of Marco Polo's fantasies, Ptolemy's miscalculations, and his own wishful thinking. He had found islands, yes, but he needed to prove they were the outskirts of Asia. He pored over his notes, trying to bend reality to fit his theory. The parrots were from the Indies, the people were Indians, the very air, he wrote, felt like April in Andalusia. He was not just an explorer. He was an author, writing the first chapter of a new story for Europe, a story that placed him at its center. By the end of January, the mood began to change. The sea's color deepened from turquoise to a bruised, angry indigo. The friendly winds grew fickle, then vanished altogether, leaving the ships becalmed for days under a searing sun. The water supplies dwindled. The men grew restless. Their optimism curdled into suspicion. Then the wind returned, but it came from the wrong direction. It blew from the northeast, a cold, sharp wind that spoke of winter storms, not Spanish shores. The ships were forced to tack against it, making slow, laborious progress. The easy journey home was over. The Atlantic was beginning to show its teeth. If you were aboard one of these ships, Watching the sky darken and hearing the first moans of the wind, would you have trusted the Admiral's promises or demanded to turn back? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. On February 12th, the change was no longer subtle. The sky turned a sickly, yellowish gray. The sea, which had been rolling in long, predictable swells, grew chaotic and choppy. A strange, oppressive silence fell, the kind that precedes immense violence. The birds that had been following the ships disappeared. Even the most experienced sailors looked to the horizon with a primal fear. That night, the storm hit. It came not as a squall, but as a detonation. The wind shrieked through the rigging, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the bone. The sea rose in a frenzy. The Nina and Pinta, which had been sailing in close company, were now tossed about like children's toys. Waves crashed over the decks, sweeping away anything not tied down. The cold was brutal, a physical blow that left the men gasping. They worked in near total darkness, lit only by the terrifying, strobe-like flashes of lightning that illuminated a world of liquid chaos. The sky and the sea had merged into a single, roaring entity. Columbus ordered the sails taken down, but it was too late. The mainsail of the Nina was torn from its mast with a sound like a thunderclap, the canvas exploding into fragments. The ship was now sailing under bare poles, utterly at the mercy of the wind and waves. She climbed mountainous seas, hanging for a terrifying moment at the crest with her rudder out of the water, before plunging sickeningly into the trough, the deck plunging into black water. Sometime during that first horrific night, the Pinta vanished. One moment, her lantern was a tiny, bobbing spark in a maelstrom. The next, it was gone, swallowed by a wave, or a squall, or simply the immense darkness. Columbus stared into the storm, his heart sinking. Was Pinzon lost? Had his rival, and the 50 men aboard the Pinta, been claimed by the sea? Or a darker thought crept into his mind. Had Pinzon, whose ship was the superior sailor, used the cover of the storm to race ahead? Was he even now speeding toward Spain, ready to deliver the news and steal the crown of glory? The thought was poison, adding a layer of human betrayal to nature's fury. But there was no time for suspicion, only survival. The crew of the Nina was broken. These were hardened sailors from the ports of Andalusia, men who had spent their lives at sea. But this was different. This was a supernatural fury. They fell to their knees on the slick, heaving deck, their prayers drowned out by the wind. They made desperate vows, promising pilgrimages and offerings if only God would spare them. They cast lots to decide who would carry a candle to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The lot fell to Columbus. Amidst the terror, the Taino men watched. Their own world had been destroyed, and now the world of their captors was being unmade before their eyes. Perhaps they saw the hand of their own gods, the Zemi, exacting revenge. Or perhaps they simply felt a universal terror, the fear of all humanity when faced with the overwhelming power of nature. They did not pray to the Christian God. They held onto the deck, their knuckles white, their faces stoic, enduring a storm within a storm. It was in this crucible of fear and doubt that Columbus resolved to save his story. He went below, to the relative quiet of his cabin, the sounds of the storm muffled but ever present. He found parchment, ink, and a quill. As the ship pitched and rolled, he began to write. He described the latitude and longitude of his discoveries. He listed the names he had given the islands: San Salvador, Santa Maria de la Concepcion, Fernandina, Isabella, Juana. He wrote of the gentle, handsome Indians who believed the Spaniards had come from heaven. He mentioned the signs of gold, the fragrant spices, the harbors large enough to hold all the fleets of Christendom. He addressed the letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, a testament of his loyalty and success. He was writing his own myth. He omitted the failures, the disappointments, the growing certainty that this was not China. He crafted a narrative of triumph, a prospectus for empire. He sealed it, wrapped it, and placed it in the barrel. He also prepared a second copy to be tied to the high stern of the ship, in the hope that if they were dashed on rocks, some part of the vessel might survive. He then climbed back to the deck, a man carrying the weight of two worlds. He threw the cask into the sea. It was a surrender, an admission that his life, his crew, and his ship were likely lost. But it was also an act of supreme ego, a belief that his story was so important, it was worth more than his own life. The barrel bobbed for a second, then was swept away, a fragile seed of history cast upon a barren, raging field. For 2 days and 2 nights, the tempest raged. The men, exhausted and hypothermic, worked on pure adrenaline. Then, on the morning of February 15th, a cry came from the lookout. Land! Through the gray mist and retreating squalls, a dark shape loomed on the horizon. It was a jagged volcanic island. Relief washed over the crew, so powerful it brought them to their knees. They had survived. They wept. They embraced. They gave thanks to a God who had seemed to abandon them. But as they drew closer, their relief turned to ice. The flag flying from the island's small settlement was not the red and gold of Castile. It was the cross of the Order of Christ. This was Santa Maria, one of the Azores. They had found land, but it was Portuguese land. They had escaped the fury of the ocean only to sail directly into the jaws of their rivals. The local governor, João de Castanheira, was immediately suspicious. When a small party from the Nina went ashore to give thanks at a chapel, as they had vowed during the storm, he had them arrested. He refused to believe Columbus's story. An unknown fleet appearing from the west, claiming to have come from the Indies. It was preposterous. He assumed they were illegal traders returning from the Portuguese-controlled coast of Guinea in Africa. Columbus, from the deck of the crippled Nina, was incandescent with rage. He was the admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy for the Spanish crown. He hoisted his royal standards and threatened to bombard the small town. It was a bluff. The Nina was in no condition to fight, but it was delivered with the absolute authority of a man who believed his own titles. A tense standoff ensued for days. Diplomats rowed back and forth between the ship and the shore. Finally, convinced by the documents Columbus produced, and perhaps fearing a diplomatic incident with Spain, the governor relented. He released the captive sailors. Shaken and exhausted, the crew of the Nina set sail again, desperate to cover the last few hundred miles to Spain. But the Atlantic was not finished with them. As they neared the coast of the Iberian Peninsula, a second storm, even more violent than the first, descended upon them. A ferocious southwesterly wind ripped their remaining sails and broke the mizzenmast. The ship was once again out of control, driven helplessly toward a rocky, unfamiliar coastline. The crew gave themselves up for lost. This time, there would be no escape. On the morning of March 4th, through sheets of blinding rain, they found themselves at the mouth of a great river. With his last reserves of skill and luck, Columbus guided the crippled vessel into the harbor. As the storm abated, he looked around and a cold dread settled over him. He knew this place. It was the River Tagus. He had found refuge in Lisbon, the capital city and naval heart of his greatest rival, the Portuguese Empire. The news of his arrival spread through the city like wildfire. A ship, claiming to have returned from the Indies by sailing west, had appeared as if from a ghost story. Columbus was immediately summoned to the court of King John II. This was the same king who, years earlier, had listened to Columbus's proposal and dismissed it as the fantasy of a boastful foreigner. Now, Columbus had to face him, not as a supplicant, but as the bearer of world-changing news. It was a moment of supreme danger and exquisite irony. He walked into the royal court, a weather-beaten mariner in the presence of a powerful monarch, knowing that some of the king's advisors were urging his immediate execution to protect Portugal's maritime secrets. He told his story carefully. He spoke of the islands, the people, the potential for wealth. He showed the king the few parrots and the small amount of gold he had. He brought forth the surviving Taino men, their presence in the cold European court a shocking, tangible proof of his claims. King John listened, his face an unreadable mask. He was a shrewd and ruthless ruler. He saw the truth in Columbus's account, and he understood its implications immediately. His monopoly on the sea route to the east was now threatened. But he also saw the danger in harming an admiral of the Spanish crown. After days of tense audiences and veiled threats, the king made a calculated decision. He would let Columbus go. He would contest the claim through treaties and papal bulls, not through assassination. On March 13th, the Nina was allowed to leave Lisbon. 2 days later, on March 15th, 1493, the battered little caravel finally sailed into the familiar harbor of Palos de la Frontera, the very port from which it had departed 7.5 months before. The townspeople who gathered at the docks could scarcely believe their eyes. The ship was a wreck, its crew skeletal and gaunt, but they were alive. The impossible voyage was complete. Then, as bells of celebration began to ring, a second miracle occurred. That very same afternoon, another ship limped into the harbor. It was the Pinta. Martín Alonso Pinzón had also survived the storm. Battered and driven off course, he had made landfall in northern Spain. Believing Columbus was lost at sea, he had sent a letter to the monarchs in Barcelona, claiming the discovery for himself and asking for an audience. He sailed for Palos, expecting to be greeted as the sole hero of the expedition. When he saw the Nina already at anchor, his spirit broke. The reply from the court arrived soon after. They would hear the news only from their admiral, Columbus. Humiliated, exhausted, and suffering from an illness contracted on the voyage, Pinzón retired to his country home. He died within the month, his name destined to become a footnote in the story he had hoped to command. The triumph belonged to Columbus alone. His journey to the court of Ferdinand and Isabella was a victory parade. He was no longer the eccentric Genoese petitioner. He was Don Cristobal Colon, admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy and governor of the islands he had claimed. He presented his evidence: the exotic birds, the strange plants, the golden masks, and he presented the Taino. Dressed in native garb and paint, they were paraded through the streets of Barcelona, living curiosities from another world. They shivered in the cool Spanish spring, their eyes wide with fear and confusion as thousands of faces stared at them. In that moment, they ceased to be men. They became artifacts, the first exhibits in the museum of a conquered world. The collision was complete. The secret was out. The barrel Columbus cast into the sea was never found. Its parchment, with its carefully crafted story, was consumed by the ocean. But the message survived, carried not in a cask of wood, but in the memory of the man who returned. His story set Europe ablaze. It launched 1,000 more ships, not for discovery, but for conquest. The 39 men left at La Navidad were found slaughtered, a grim overture to the violence that would follow. The Taino people of Hispaniola, who Columbus described as gentle and full of love, will be virtually extinct within a single generation, wiped out by disease, slavery, and despair. The return of the Nina was not the end of a voyage. It was the beginning of the modern age, an age born in a tempest of ambition, courage, and cruelty. Columbus did not discover a new world. He connected 2 old worlds. And in doing so, he and the men who followed him set in motion a chain of events that would erase one of them from the map. The sea does not keep secrets, but sometimes the stories it swallows are kinder than the ones that wash ashore. The real tragedy was not what might have been lost in that storm, but what was found. Thank you for joining us on this voyage into the past. If you believe these stories must be told, subscribe to our channel and share this narrative. History is not just what happened, but who gets to tell the tale. We'll see you on the next expedition.